Today we're going to talk about geologic change over time, which basically is fossils. Alright, so we're starting with the principle of uniformitarianism. So this is the geologic process that that's happened in the past and basically can be explained by current geological processes. So anything that's happened in the past is explainable by things that are currently happening, such as volcanism and erosion. So we know that volcanoes erupted in the past. We know this from archaeological dig sites such as Pompeii that has been excavated, and that happened in 79 AD. And we also know it from erosion of things that we have found in various parts of the world over many, many finds. We also know that geologic change is slow and gradual, meaning it's not something that's going to happen quickly, and that sudden changes have affected Earth's history, such as the belief that asteroids killed the dinosaurs. So when we're talking about fossils, there are several types. But what is a fossil? A fossil is a trace remain. It could be a trace or a remain, actually, of an organism that lived long ago. And so it could be that you find the entire organism intact, such as this one, or it could be that you just find a footprint. There are lots of different types. So as we look at the types, we're going to start with one called amber. It's trapped in amber. A lot of times people remember this from Jurassic Park. So this is amber. It's kind of like a hardened tree sap, and it often catches an entire insect or an entire bug, essentially, inside it. So this would be like an entire fossilized specimen of that insect. The second thing is trapped in asphalt. These tar pits are in, the La Brea tar pits are in California. This is an example of tar pit. Obviously, this is just kind of like a basic picture, but it does show what insects were like in California in the past as well. So tar pits are kind of like, tar is kind of like what they put asphalt in. It's like that really sticky, gooey, black, thick material. We also have rocks that are buried in rock, or fossils per se, because yes, the rock would be in rock, but the dead organisms quickly become buried by sediments. So basically the rock gets buried within the rock, and that rock itself is a fossil specimen. So this allows for bones to be preserved and basically become part of rock over hundreds of years. And there's also the possibility of petrification or becoming petrified. So this is petrified wood. There is an entire petrified forest out in the west part of US. And basically what happens if something becomes petrified, organisms' tissues decay, and over many, many years, those tissues become replaced with hardened minerals. And so you get these pretty colors that have replaced what organism was living within that. And then the last one is they become frozen. And this is when a plant or an animal freezes when it dies, and it essentially is frozen in time. And the incredible cold temperatures will preserve the skin and the bones of the organism. Sometimes, such as this right here, you can find whole woolly mammoths intact. There's a really neat documentary about it and called Discovering the Mammoth, and it basically shows how those actual artifacts are more preserved than most of the others, because normally when we find a fossil, you're just finding an actual bone. Whereas in this case, you're finding not only the bone, but more of the actual skin, and sometimes even as much informational detail as including the fur. All right, and then the last one is a trace fossil. And a trace fossil basically gives you an idea about what the animal might have done and behavioral patterns that it might have followed. And the three main types of trace fossils are going to be footprints, burrows, and coprolites. So a fossilized structure formed in sedimentary rock by animal activity or in soft sediment. That's where you're going to find trace fossils. Normally they're in sedimentary rock because of what type they are and because it's softer. But let's talk about it. So this would be a footprint, just an actual footprint. If you found just like a piece with a footprint in it, or even could be a different type of print, but normally it is footprint. You could find a burrow, which is like the habitat they might have had, or you could find a coprolite, which if you do not know what that is, it is hardened and basically preserved animal poop. So what do fossils tell us? Well, they pretty much show us pretty much about the history of life. And in that history, it shows and highlights things like environmental changes and how life forms have changed. So we know where if we find fish fossils that at one point there was an aquatic environment there. Whether it means it currently is aquatic, it may or may not be, it does give us definite indicators that it was once. That's really important to know. Palm fronds represent a tropical environment, kind of like a palm frond is like a palm tree plant. And so that would tell us that that area was very warm and tropical at one point. And then something to consider that supports these things, the trees and the dinosaur fossils have been found on places like Antarctica. And those palm fronds that they found have indicated that it was once a much warmer environment than it is today, where it's pretty much completely frozen. This is the Glossopteris, which is a fern fossil, which would also indicate warmer environment. So, they tell us about the features on Earth. One of the neat things they tell us is about things like Pangea. So Pangea is the belief that a single landmass existed about 200 million years ago, and that would be the single landmass from all the current landmasses that we have today in the world. And we do have several evidences for those, and those evidences come in the form of fossils. So looking at this picture, we have fossil remains of this reptile, which was living in the Triassic period on both South America and Africa. We have this Triassic land reptile, the Lystrosaurus, in Africa, what's now the island off Africa, India, and Antarctica. Then we have the Mesosaurus, which was a freshwater reptile between South America and Africa. And then we have the interesting one, the Glossopteris, which was the fern plant on the last one, that goes over all of them, Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, and South America, indicating that all 5 of these areas were once very tropical. Now, some of those areas are still tropical. Parts of Africa, tropical. Parts of Australia, tropical. But places like Antarctica, definitely not tropical. So, in addition to this, you have to look that things line up. The mountains line up, and so do the actual continents themselves, that they could have fit together in puzzle pieces. So all part of the evidence for Pangea. All right, so land forms change over time. Weathering and erosion are always changing the Earth's surface, and tectonic plates are going to move and create landforms. So they basically do 3 major components of creation of landforms. So they are what we would call a constructive or destructive force. So if they come together, they collide and they create mountains. If they pull apart, magma will rise and create volcanoes and essentially new land. And if they slide past one another, you'll get cracking in the earth, and essentially you'll get an earthquake that's an immediate result. So all of these red places here are the outlines of the actual plate boundaries that we are aware of today. And so all of these things are either colliding, pulling apart, or sliding past. So what do other materials tell us about Earth's history? Trees can tell us about the climate of an area. If you were to cut a tree down, or even just a small branch, you can look inside, and the rings tell you how old the tree is itself. But they also tell you a few other things, like thick rings tell you that the rain and the temperatures were good that year. So maybe you're counting how many there are and you're on ring 17. In the 17th year of that tree's life, things were good. Thin rings tell you there were poor growing conditions and the tree was struggling because he wasn't getting enough nutrients. All right, they also tell us about seafloor sediments, where chemical compositions of the sediments, or the seashells that you would find in the ocean, essentially, shows what the composition of the ocean water and atmosphere were, where they were living when they were alive. So we are able to take things from the shells. And then ice. Core ice bands show amounts of rainfall very similar to that of the trees. This is a core ice sample right here. It shows the composition of water and gases, the concentration of those gases, basically show the conditions of the atmosphere when that ice forms specifically. So let's see. Evidence. A scientist finds a fossil of a shark tooth in a layer of rock high in the mountains. What could that mean? It could mean that the area of the mountains were essentially at one point covered by an ocean. All right, B. Rocks from mountains on 2 different continents were found to have formed at the same time and to have the same composition. What could that mean? The mountains were formed together at the same time and then essentially broke apart when the land masses moved away. And then C, upon studying an ice core, scientists find that a particular band is very wide. What could that mean? It does mean that the year that ice formed, there was a lot of rainfall.